People whose marriage lasted less than a year. What went wrong? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. We had been dating for a couple of years and were deeply in love, so naturally we got married. Up until that point, there had been no issues between us. She had just finished her studies and had a friend from TAFE whom she was close with, a male study buddy. I was fine with it, never one to control who she spent time with. On our wedding day, everything went smoothly, and we had the following day free before heading out for our honeymoon, to tie up any loose ends like returning rented equipment and packing. While we were in the middle of running errands, we stopped for lunch, and she got a message from this guy asking for help with his studies. She seemed really eager to go, even though we had a lot left to do. Up until this point, I hadn't thought much of her friendship with him, but something about her eagerness to leave didn't sit right with me. I let her go, thinking I might be overthinking it, and finished the errands on my own. It was an awkward conversation with her parents, though, when I showed up alone to collect things from their house. They were surprised that she went off with him the day after our wedding. They didn't like it either, but I assumed it was innocent, so I didn't make a big deal of it. The next day, we flew out for our honeymoon, but once we landed, she got another message. And from then on, they were messaging each other every day, even while we were on our honeymoon. It got to the point where I had to bring it up. I didn't think it was respectful or appropriate, especially on our honeymoon. She didn't see it that way, though, and it created tension between us. When we got back, life settled into a routine, but the messages kept coming, and she even invited him over to dinner one night so I could meet him, since I had shared my concerns. As time went on, it started to feel like they were hanging out more without me around, sometimes not even coming home until the early hours of the morning. We fought more and more because I felt like boundaries were being crossed. She kept insisting they were just friends, but it was becoming clear that this was straining our marriage. One night, after a particularly bad fight, she didn't come home until 4:30 a.m. and tried to sneak into bed. I was furious and told her that she needed to stop seeing him. She then told me I should stop seeing my best friend, who just happened to be gay, and implied that I might be cheating with him. I agreed to stop seeing my best friend, even though it felt like a double standard, just to show I was putting her first. But she broke down in tears, begging me not to make her stop seeing this guy. She insisted that if I did, she would hate me, and we might as well divorce then and there. I relented, allowing her to keep hanging out with him, and the situation continued for 10 months, filled with constant arguments. Eventually, after another huge fight, I asked for a divorce. It devastated me, and I struggled for years to come to terms with it. Soon after, she and this guy started dating. Throughout all of this, she saw it as my problem and never admitted she had done anything wrong. I'll never know if they were physical during our marriage, but I honestly believe they were. Story 2. My wife had expressed an interest in exploring her bisexuality before we got married, and we both agreed to her experimenting with another woman. Things were fine at first, and the first month of marriage went smoothly. However, the other woman ended up moving in with us due to a difficult situation, and I started feeling uncomfortable with how much time they spent together. Around the time of our wedding, I lost my job, and while I quickly found another one, the combination of that stress and the increasing distance I felt from my wife led me to start drinking more than usual. I began sending her insecure messages while I was drunk, which didn't help the situation. After about 2 months, I asked the other woman to move out, feeling the weight of everything, but my wife defended her. Neither of us felt like the situation was getting better. A few months later, my wife went to the other woman's wedding, and when she returned, she said she wanted to leave me. She said she would stay if I stopped drinking, but by then, her attachment to the other woman was so strong that she didn't notice the changes I had made. 2 weeks ago, she left, and I'm still processing the end of our 5.5-year relationship and friendship. It's been an emotionally difficult time, especially since I think things started to shift in late October. We had a serious conversation last week where we acknowledged the issues that led to this, mainly a lack of communication and effort on both sides. I still believe we could have worked things out with better communication and more time spent together, but I think she wasn't as ready to settle down as she initially thought. Her relationship with the other woman likely caused deeper issues, and while my main concern was the lack of time we spent together, it feels like we couldn't resolve that. There are a lot of regrets, but I know time will help me heal. On a positive note, I've been able to stay sober, though I don't feel like that alone will change the situation. Story 3. He went through the police academy while we were engaged and joined the force just before our wedding. When we returned from our honeymoon, he was given his official equipment, including his service weapons, badges, and other tools of the job. That's when I began to notice a troubling change in his personality. He became overly controlling and fixated on having his way, often insisting that everyone should follow his plan because he was now the authority. This behavior was especially hard on me, as he started treating me more like his possession than a partner. He also had a hidden struggle with alcohol, something I hadn't known about until after the wedding. I hoped that his new responsibilities would inspire him to make positive changes, but unfortunately, things only got worse. He would sometimes drink to excess and handle his equipment in ways that made me feel very unsafe. I even got into the habit of double-checking his gear to make sure everything was secure. His words became hurtful too. He would often put me down, saying things to erode my confidence, making me feel isolated and afraid to speak up. I was in a tough situation, feeling like there was no one to turn to for help. The straw that broke the camel's back was at night when he went out drinking and came home in the mood for some confrontation. He woke me up demanding sex. I refused because he was sloppily drunk and reeked of cigarette smoke and alcohol. In his anger at my rejection, he dragged me from bed and started to get aggressive. He had never physically hurt me before. He was smart enough to avoid places that couldn't be concealed by clothes and makeup. And then, he took his service weapon and, because I had removed the clip and bullets, his attempt to shoot was a failure. Enraged by this, he continued what he was doing until he exhausted himself and passed out on the floor. That night, I decided I couldn't stay in the marriage any longer. The situation had reached a breaking point. I packed a small bag, took my cat, and left. I filed for divorce soon after, determined to move forward. It's been 7 years, and I still have nightmares and difficulty with intimacy. We were only married for 11 months, but it was a challenging chapter that I am grateful to have closed. Story 4. I went to school with a girl who got married in July 2016 after dating a guy for only 3 months. By November that same year, they were divorced, right after the presidential election. It turned out one of them was an extreme conservative and the other an extreme liberal, something they hadn't realized until then. Story 5. My cousin was married for just 18 hours or something equally absurd. According to her, there was a huge, almost apocalyptic argument on their wedding night about where their relationship was headed from there. The lesson here seems to be that before you get married, it's crucial for you and your spouse to have similar expectations for what marriage will look like. Things like how many kids you want, when to have them, where you'll live, whether both of you will work, and how you'll handle money. These aren't things that magically work themselves out over time. Story 6. This story might not fully fit here since we got married right after high school in 2011. Although we're still technically married, we've been separated, and the divorce paperwork is complete. Sharing this feels like it could help me move forward. We had been together for about 2 years before getting married, and we'd already been living together because my family's house was foreclosed. After we got married, things were great. I was working full-time and going to school, and she started a new job. That's when she began texting a guy she worked with, which quickly became a daily thing. During this time, I was under a lot of stress from a recent promotion and was only getting about 4 hours of sleep each night. In my free time, I'd play games to unwind. She didn't seem to like that I had this hobby, and I felt uncomfortable with how much she was texting this new guy. She suggested I meet him, but it only made me feel more frustrated, creating more distance between us. A few weeks later, in September 2014, she told me she was unhappy and was going to stay with a friend to figure out if she wanted to stay married. I'm the kind of person who believes in giving people space, so I didn't push her to stay. A week later, she messaged me to say it was over and that she'd be getting her things. For the next month, I slept on the floor since I couldn't afford a bed, and it was one of the hardest times of my life. About 6 months later, we met up to separate our car insurance. She broke down and confessed that the guy she'd been seeing had been emotionally and physically abusive. She told me he had also pressured her into ending a pregnancy because his family's beliefs didn't align with having a child outside of marriage. Despite everything, I helped her through it because, at the time, I still cared about her. After she broke up with him, I moved into her apartment and we tried again. I even spent $3,000 on a 7-day Disneyland trip, hoping to rebuild things. But 4 months later, she told me she still had feelings for him, so I saved up money and moved out. Months after I left, she reached out to tell me she was pregnant, and the timing matched with our relationship. I was initially shocked but then excited about becoming a father. I put aside all the hard feelings and had her move in with me. My son, Micah, was born on March 1, 2016. It was the happiest day of my life, and fatherhood became my world. Even with all the challenges, nothing could bring me down. Then, 5 months ago, the guy reached out to her, asking for a DNA test. He claimed that he and she had been together at a party during the time Micah was conceived. She assured me he wasn't there, But eventually, I agreed to the test to settle things once and for all. I wasn't worried, I felt certain Micah was mine. When the results came back, I opened the email at work. The results showed that I wasn't related to my son. I felt shattered. Now, it's been 3 weeks since I moved out. Losing that connection to Micah has been the hardest part of it all. People say that pain like this will pass, but right now, it feels endless. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story. Appreciate the blessings of marriage and family. Some aren't as fortunate. Know the person you're committing to, it could save you a lot of heartache in the future. Story 7. About 30 seconds after we left the church, he became insanely jealous. He demanded I quit attending university, insisted I could only wear the clothes he picked out for me. Apparently, my torn jeans and oversized hoodies were too sexy, and said that if he couldn't chaperone me whenever I left the house, his mother would have to do it instead. He was convinced that I was cheating on him with everyone, from the mailman to every professor, associate, postdoc, and dean at the university. I still don't know how he thought I could manage to cheat with over 3,000 people, but somehow, he was sure of it. He started accusing me of being a gold digger, even though he didn't have a dime to his name, claiming I did nothing but sit around all day, which is hard to believe if I'm supposedly juggling affairs with more than 3,000 people. And just a month into our marriage, he slapped me across the face with his wallet. He had the classic Pikachu face when he got the divorce papers. Story 8. 2 months into our relationship, he told me I was too fat and that he wouldn't be intimate with me anymore. I lost 75 pounds in 3 months, though I did it the unhealthy way, and then he told me he was already seeing someone else. He was shocked when my parents refused to keep paying his bills, and just 30 days later, he was kicked off their property, thanks to the laws in my state. Story 9. We had been together for just over 2 years and were in the process of buying a flat and trying for a baby. We got married in New York, and it was amazing. But just a couple of weeks later, he started acting distant and cold. I kept asking him what was wrong, but his response was always, "You should know what's wrong." I noticed that my best friend was also acting strangely. Stories didn't add up, and they both lied to me. When I caught on and confronted him, he still gave me vague answers, telling me I should already know the reason. I even noticed that he started hiding his phone, keeping it in his underwear when he showered. About 4 weeks after the wedding, he asked for a divorce. By then, I had put the pieces together. My best friend was avoiding my calls and never gave me an explanation. I accused him of being involved with my best friend, who, by the way, was married to his best friend, but he flatly denied it. He told everyone I was mentally ill and making things up, and then he moved out. A month later, after nearly everyone I knew had distanced themselves from me, I saw on Facebook that the two of them had gone to a party and kissed each other in front of everyone. That moment absolutely shattered me. I focused on going to the gym and working to cope with the heartbreak, and I ended up in the best shape of my life. Meanwhile, my ex-best friend also began divorcing her husband. They were together for a few months but broke up. Later, he apologized and asked if he could come back, but I said no. And that's the story of my 4-week marriage and how I found healing in the gym. Story 10. We'd been dating for about 3 years and reached a crossroads. We'd both just finished school. I was considering job offers and possible moves, while he was having a big moment of panic about being apart. He suggested we get married, and it didn't take much to convince me. I was nervous about moving to a new place alone, and marriage felt like a safer choice. After we got married, I started working. Meanwhile, he decided to go back to school for another degree. About 6 months into his studies, he got recruited for a job 1,000 miles away. He accepted the offer without talking to me first, but we packed up and moved. Now he was working, and I was too. But while he had a job he was excited about, I had a low-paying, unfulfilling job since it was all I could find in the area. Soon he got another job offer from a different company, and we moved again. This time, we ended up in a rented trailer since it was the only place we could find quickly. He was working 12-hour days, and I was left at home with no job, no car, and no friends. Honestly, I wasn't the best partner in those days. Being home alone all day with nothing to do was driving me crazy. When he'd get home after his long workdays, he was understandably exhausted, and I'd get upset that we never went out. Eventually, he started hanging out with his work friends, probably to avoid the tension at home. Then he started seeing other women. I'm not sure how many, but I know about 2 for certain. I found out about them through the friends I'd made, mainly the wives of people he worked with. When I confronted him, he said he hadn't realized how hard marriage would be. At that point, I'd had enough. I took the car and drove back home, leaving him in that trailer without transportation. A few months later, he asked me to file for divorce. I refused, telling him that since he'd caused the breakup, he could be the one to file and explain it to his attorney and the judge. Eventually, he sent me the divorce papers in the mail. About 10 years later, he called to apologize for how he'd acted. But looking back, I know it wasn't entirely his fault either. Story 11. My marriage lasted just over a year, though we had dated for 7 years and lived together for 3. It ended when I found out she was involved with someone from work. While her choices ultimately led to the end of our marriage, I have to be honest with myself and acknowledge my own role in what happened. We got married shortly after I finished law school. She had supported us while I was in school, working as a server in a high-end restaurant, where she built strong connections. We had moved to that city for law school. I didn't fully appreciate how much she had grown to love the city and her workplace, since she often complained about both, until the tearful goodbyes began as we prepared to leave. When I graduated, I was offered an incredible career opportunity in our hometown, and I pushed hard for us to move back. Back home, she found another job in fine dining, and I started my demanding new position, where I was working 60 to 90 hours a week to keep up with the caseload. My long hours and lengthy commute took a toll, and I became exhausted, irritable, and distant from friends, eventually sinking into depression. The work was important to me, and I told myself the intense schedule was only temporary. But to her, it seemed like I was neglecting her to climb the career ladder. The truth was, I worked myself to exhaustion because I wanted to secure a stable future for us. Every day, the thought of providing for us kept me going, but I never told her that. I assumed she'd just understand. It's a tough realization that so much could unravel over such a simple misunderstanding. Finding out she was gone shook me to my core. I left my job, having built up enough experience to find another role when I was ready, and went backpacking through Colorado to rediscover myself. Eventually, the person she'd been seeing moved on, and I heard she was deeply unhappy. But I had come to terms with the fact that her happiness was no longer my responsibility, and I knew I wasn't the person to help her move forward. I don't hold on to resentment toward her. I have enough to work through on my own without carrying that weight. I emerged from the experience stronger, more compassionate, and happier, but I still think about the cost. Even now, I can't help but feel that with a few small changes, we could have stayed a happily married couple. Life goes on, though, and it has a way of surprising us. Story 12. We lasted just over a year. The first red flag came on our first night back from the honeymoon. He decided to sleep on the couch because it was more comfortable for him, and that became his routine nearly every night. He barely acknowledged me unless there was a work event he wanted me to attend. One day, just half an hour after I returned from abdominal surgery, he asked me what I was going to make for dinner. The final straw came when he yelled at me for spending $8 on a pair of shoes for my grandfather's funeral, yet the very next day, he spent $800 on a single golf club. There were countless little things like this that made me realize he was perfectly fine with me being miserable. During that year, I started to develop a sense of self-respect and came to the conclusion that I deserved better. Story 13. Mine lasted just over a year. I married my girlfriend of 4 years right before deploying. She didn't have much to keep her busy while I was away, no job or hobbies, and unfortunately ended up getting involved with drugs. During a 2-week leave in the middle of my deployment, I got her pregnant. She felt so trapped that she convinced me to agree to an adoption plan for our baby once she was born. I was so in love with her that I went along with whatever she wanted. A week after our daughter was born, she decided to leave me and canceled the adoption, taking our daughter back from the adoptive parents. In time, she returned to her old habits. I'm fairly sure she stayed clean while pregnant, and had 2 more kids. Unfortunately, Child Protective Services eventually intervened, and I was granted full custody of my daughter. Not a day goes by that I don't look at my little girl and feel grateful to have her in my life. I'm incredibly thankful to be raising this amazing, lively little girl. Story 14. The day after our wedding, a sheriff showed up at our doorstep with child support papers for a 3-month-old baby. It turned out that he had been involved with a coworker. I was willing to overlook the mistake, but when he refused to take responsibility for his child, I just couldn't accept it anymore. I couldn't let the child suffer because of his decisions. We finalized the divorce 11 months after our wedding day. Story 15. My ex had been previously engaged to a man with a terminal illness. They were together for many years, but he ended the relationship, saying it was for her own good. She also carried a lot of emotional weight from past trauma, including abuse by her father. We were very good friends in high school and reconnected more than 10 years later. She was very open with me about everything, so I knew what I was stepping into. After a broken heart and a challenging family situation, she found comfort in an old friend. I think she confused safety and familiarity with love. By many standards, she was way out of my league, and I tried my best to give her everything she needed. However, she was struggling with many complicated emotions. Because of her past, she rarely enjoyed intimacy and felt like she was letting me down as a wife, even though I told her I understood and never pressured her. When she needed space, I gave it to her, but when she needed someone to talk to, I tried to be there. The problem was, she had a deep history with her ex-fiancé, and at times, she would call him late at night during his third-shift job. At first, I tried to be understanding, but it hurt. I knew she still loved him. We had our struggles and even tried separating, but it was a roller coaster. One night, while lying in bed, she asked me, "Is it worth it?" referring to all the ups and downs of the past year. I said, "Of course it is. I love you. As long as we love each other enough, it's worth it." She looked at me with a look of guilt, and that's when I realized she didn't feel the same. Not another word was spoken. I got up and slept on the couch, and the next morning, I left for good. That was 8 years ago. I've had a few relationships since then but have never remarried. I don't expect many will read this far, and that's okay. Writing it out was a bit therapeutic. So, thank you to the stranger on the internet who asked a question no one close to me has in years. Back then, I just brushed it off because I didn't want to talk about it. At least we didn't have kids or shared assets, so our divorce was more like a breakup with a bit of paperwork. Story 16. This is a bit of a tough one, and it happened to a friend of mine. We were deployed to Okinawa, and my friend married his girlfriend right before he left. While he was still deployed, he found out she had cheated on him. The way he found out, though, was pretty shocking. One day, he checked his Facebook and saw a message from a guy he didn't know. The guy basically told him that he had slept with his wife. He didn't even know she was married, and when he looked at her Facebook, he saw she was married to my friend. The guy felt guilty and reached out to let him know. My friend didn't waste any time. He ended up getting a divorce while he was still in Okinawa. I'm not sure how it all worked legally, but I remember him handling some kind of paperwork the very next day. Story 17. She started feeling trapped, feeling like my expectation of exclusivity was too much for her. So, she explored polyamory, decided she wanted to pursue it with her boss, and felt it was worth opening the marriage. She was pretty shocked when I decided to get a divorce. Story 18. After spending a year together, we got married so he wouldn't get deported. I took care of him, paid all the bills, and sponsored him. Turns out, he was already married back in his home country. It took me a while to get over the bitterness of the thousands of dollars I was scammed out of. My dad had recently passed away, and I guess he saw me as an easy target, like a lion spotting a wounded gazelle. Edit. I'm Canadian and he's Swiss New Zealander, holding both passports. We met when he was visiting Canada. He fled when he realized he was caught and was eventually deported. I have no idea what happened after that. Story 19. I had a cousin who married a real piece of work. For some background, my extended family is known for drinking too much, getting loud, and causing chaos. Our family reunions had been kicked out of multiple venues over the years. One year, my cousin shows up with her fiancé, and he's a total nightmare. He starts picking fights, lighting fireworks, and scaring people's pets. He was so bad that my uncle, her dad, who's probably the loudest and most obnoxious of the group, had to pull him aside and tell him, "You need to tone it down." She married him anyway, not realizing that was him on his best behavior. They lasted less than a year. She won't talk about it, but the rumor was that she found out he was struggling with meth addiction. Story 20. I eventually realized she was trying to isolate me from my friends and family, aiming to control me the way her mom controls her dad. The warning signs were all there, but I ignored them. We ended up divorced after just 6 weeks. Story 21. I refer to it as my starter marriage. He completely misrepresented who he was. He seemed willing to move mountains for us, but once we were married, he became controlling, so much so that he even changed how my keys were arranged on my keychain. This was back when cars and homes still used actual keys. He refused to mow the lawn and would argue about the tickets he got for it, claiming that the base allowed 12-inch grass and his was only 11.5. He'd eat all the food in the house, leaving nothing for me, then complain about not being able to lose weight. His gift-giving went from diamond earrings before marriage to a muffler, still in the box, after marriage. A muffler is for car maintenance, not a birthday gift. The final straw for me was when he got angry at our kitten for simply being a kitten and threw him across the room. If he could do that to an animal, what would he do to a child? I left after 7 months. We didn't even make it a year. Story 22. This story isn't about me, but a friend of mine. Their marriage ended on the day of the wedding reception. The groom got extremely intoxicated and, in an awful moment, slapped the bride's child from a previous relationship and then struck the bride. The bride filed for an annulment the very next morning. Edit. The groom worked as a truck driver, which meant he and the bride didn't spend a lot of time together throughout their relationship, so she didn't realize his behavior could be like that. The incident occurred behind closed doors and was kept quiet initially to save face. I'm not well versed in marriage law, but I was told she intended to file for an annulment, which is what I mentioned here. This happened about 10 years ago, and I'm no longer in contact with the bride, but the last I heard, she was doing better and had moved on. Unfortunately, the groom had accumulated a significant amount of debt in the bride's name, which wasn't discovered until things started falling apart. I believe he's now in jail. Story 23. This isn't my story, but a fraternity brother of my husband had a marriage that lasted maybe 100 days before they parted ways. Apparently, she didn't fully understand that marrying someone in the military would mean frequent moves, while he just assumed she knew and was okay with it. Story 24. This happened to some friends of mine. The husband suggested an open marriage, and for some reason, the wife agreed. Fast forward 3 months into the marriage. He gets jealous when they meet a guy who's attractive, and the wife ends up liking him more than her husband. They lasted 6 months. Story 25. A friend of mine from high school got married and divorced within just 3 months. I vividly remember attending her wedding and seeing her cry as she walked down the aisle and during her vows. At the time, we all thought it was so emotional and beautiful. But later, she confided in me that she was crying because deep down, she knew she was making a huge mistake. The vows really scared her. I think she was caught up in the excitement of wedding planning and the idea of marriage, but wasn't fully ready for the reality of it. Even now, in her 30s, she still struggles with emotional maturity. Story 26. This story is a tough one. My college roommate met a girl during our junior year that our entire group felt was totally wrong for him. But, of course, love is blind. Fast forward to the summer after graduation, and they're set to marry in the fall. I'm at the wedding party. They were apart for most of the summer. He was working while she was finishing school and handling wedding plans. We all gathered in her hometown in Colorado for the big day. The wedding was huge, and a lot of money was spent. After the ceremony, we sent them off on their honeymoon, and I returned home to St. Louis. 7 days later, I got a call from him asking if he could crash at my place. Naturally, I agree. I picked him up at the airport and he's single. We hit the nearest bar at his request, and I find out that over the summer she had cheated on him. But she still went ahead with the wedding because she felt pressured by how much her parents were paying. She told him right after the ceremony, but not during the days leading up to it. She insisted they go on the honeymoon to work things out, but refused to be intimate because she still had feelings for the other guy. So, he never went back to her. He got checked for STDs, all clear, and had the marriage annulled within 6 months. Belinda, F you for what you did to my friend. Story 27. I was married for just over a year. We were high school sweethearts and got married right after graduation. Unfortunately, our time together was marked by a series of tough life events. We moved closer to her college but had to move back home because of financial struggles, and during that time, my grandmother passed away. Things were tough, and we were pretty poor, but we managed for a while. Eventually, we moved out of my mom's house and into our own apartment. We had jobs, a steady income, and we started to feel like things were looking up. Then, I got seriously ill, which kept me out of work. The combination of medical bills and rent made things hard again, and we found ourselves struggling. Both of us were dealing with mental health issues at the time, anxiety and depression, and things just became more difficult. She grew closer to a coworker while I was out of work, and they're together now. I moved out in November 2015, and we were married in July 2014. Our divorce was finalized in April last year. We haven't spoken much since, and it's still a bit difficult to think about, but I've been doing much better in recent months. Edit. This got more attention than I expected, so I just want to clarify, I don't blame my ex for our divorce. This is just a small glimpse into the many challenges we faced, and both of us had our own shortcomings that contributed to it. I don't hold any hard feelings towards her anymore. Story 28. We rushed into marriage because she was pregnant, and I already loved her, so I wasn't concerned about the timing. I was working long hours so she could stay home with the baby, and as time went on, our schedules shifted, and we started spending less time together. She struggled with postpartum depression and started spending long nights playing online role-playing games, where she met a guy who didn't work and lived off his mom, someone who had all the time in the world to talk to her. To make a long story short, she kissed our daughter goodbye, handed her over to me, and ran off with him. Fast forward more than a decade, and we're now good friends. My daughter is curled up beside me as I type this, playing on her tablet. As for the karma of it all, time and lifestyle haven't been kind to her, and our daughter, who trusts me more, would rather be with me. Story 29. A friend of mine found out the night before his wedding that his soon-to-be wife had slept with her ex. Despite this, he went through with the ceremony. But as the vicar finished, he stood up, confessed everything in front of everyone, threw the ring away, and asked the vicar if there was a way to take it all back. Story 30. I almost called off the wedding, but I convinced myself it was just cold feet. He was constantly angry and judgmental. After we got married, he moved us into his mom's house while he looked for work, and I was still studying at the time. No matter what I did, it was never enough for him. Everyone around him was stupid, and every job was beneath him. His mom eventually found him a job through a friend, but after just 2 days, he threatened to crash the car into a tree if he was forced to go back. He said he'd rather be homeless than do a job he didn't want. When his brother asked, "What about your wife, you're married now?" he replied, "Oh, she'll follow." I forced him to go to therapy and moved to a bigger city so I could find work. But then, he decided he wanted to work in Canada, and that's when I knew I couldn't follow him to a place where I didn't know anyone. I asked for a break to figure things out. He told me it was either stay together or leave, but he didn't believe in breaks, so I left. It was 9 months after the wedding. He was unsupportive of everything I did. At the time, I was working on the first draft of my book, but when people asked him about it, he couldn't even remember the genre. He read a couple of chapters and said, "None of the characters are like me." He created tension between our families, and looking back, I understand now that he was deeply depressed. But after the first few therapy sessions, he refused to go back and blamed me for everything. I tolerated it because I had my own unresolved trauma. After that, I ended up in another toxic relationship with another angry man, and that wasted another 9 years of my life. Now, I've made it a priority to remove angry people from my life completely. Story 31. I had 2 close friends who were brothers, and they were both known for their wild, carefree lifestyles. They spent their weekends partying, drinking at bars, and getting involved with various women, along with recreational drug use. Their role models were the Jackass crew, and they thrived on that kind of bachelor lifestyle. Honestly, I was a bit envious of the freedom and fun they seemed to have. I, on the other hand, was in a long-term relationship for many years. Eventually, the younger brother found someone he wanted to settle down with and got engaged to a wonderful woman. But the older brother had a shift in his mindset. Suddenly, he seemed to be in a race to get married before his younger brother, continuing his bachelor ways while announcing one day that he was engaged and had set a wedding date, 6 months before his younger brother. None of us had met the woman until we were told about the engagement. When we did meet her, it was obvious that he hadn't been honest with her about his lifestyle. She was prim, proper, and very quiet, and she only knew the professional side of him since they worked together. As the months passed, his partying habits didn't stop. He was still cheating with one-night stands, and she remained completely unaware. Our group of friends urged him to come clean, but he refused. Eventually, I was nominated to be the one to tell her. I met her for coffee and explained everything, his infidelity and drug use. She was shocked, but she told me directly that she was still going to marry him, believing she could change him. After that, I left feeling like I had done the right thing. The wedding day arrived, and it was a disaster. He was drunk before the reception even started and passed out in a corner after dinner. As I was leaving, I said goodbye to his bride, and I could see the regret in her eyes. It was heartbreaking to witness. They were together for exactly 1 year. The final straw came on their anniversary. She had planned a special brunch at a nice restaurant, but he went out partying the night before, promising to be home in time to rest before their celebration. Instead, he hooked up with someone he met at the bar, and when he finally returned home the next afternoon, she had packed her bags and left. At first, I felt sorry for her, but then I remembered that I had laid everything out for her, and she chose to marry him anyway. I haven't seen or spoken to her since. My friend continued his pattern and is now on his 4th marriage, though it seems like he might finally be settling down this time. Story 32. On our honeymoon, she didn't want to do anything but argue, so I ended up leaving 2 days early to go back home and be with my dog. After that, she stopped wearing her wedding ring and refused to tell people we were married, instead referring to me as her boyfriend. The breaking point came when my grandpa was dying, and she casually said, "I wish he'd just hurry up and die already. I'm tired of this apartment being so depressing all the time." I made it 4 months before I filed for divorce. Story 33. To be honest, I wasn't really sure I wanted to marry her, but she was determined to be married by the time she was 24. At that time, I had a hard time saying no to her. I was working over 60 hours a week in a kitchen to help cover our expenses, and I was also struggling with my mental health. As a result, we grew emotionally distant. Less than 5 months into our marriage, I found out she had been unfaithful to me for at least a year, dating back to 6 or 7 months before our wedding. While she had been planning the wedding, she had been sleeping with other people. On top of that, she had an abortion because she wasn't sure if I was the father. When I discovered all of this, I had a complete breakdown and even tried to take my own life. In the years that followed, I spent a long time blaming myself for the collapse of my marriage and for her actions. Story 34. Marriage requires a lot of work, including compassion, empathy, and attentiveness. It's about caring for each other's feelings, listening actively, and sharing your vulnerabilities to help your partner understand and support you better. Marriage won't fix existing problems, and you should never marry just for the sake of having children. Before getting married, it's essential to have in-depth discussions about your future together. Politics, parenting styles, how many children you want, finances, where you'll live, and how you'll handle potential challenges. You should have at least 2 important things in common, as interests may change over time. It's also important to talk about how marriage might affect your relationship and ensure you fully understand each other's past, including how you were raised and what that means for your values and behavior. Disagreements are normal as long as they lead to healthy communication and help resolve issues. Kindness is key, and you must know your own needs in a relationship, while respecting that your partner's needs may differ. Make sure you find balance before marrying. Lastly, don't shy away from the hard conversations. If you can't discuss difficult topics like personal habits or relationship issues, then marriage might not be the right choice. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.